The yellow lines blur into an endless, hypnotic ribbon. It is 3 in the morning, and the pitch black darkness pressing against your windshield feels heavy enough to crush you. Out here, on the isolated, forgotten veins of the country, the rules of reality begin to fray. You check your mirrors, expecting to see nothing but empty asphalt. Instead, your taillights catch a silhouette, something impossibly tall, something that shouldn't exist. And the most terrifying part? It is gaining on you. Welcome to Channel 19 Mysteries. I'm your host, Midnight Rider, broadcasting to you from the darkest stretches of the open road. If you find yourself drawn to the unexplained, the unsettling, and the things that lurk just beyond the reach of our headlights, you have come to the right place. Before we shift into gear, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment down below sharing your own strange roadside encounters. It helps keep the engine running and the high beams on. Now, let's get into tonight's stories. Five true highway horrors. There is a very specific type of isolation that belongs exclusively to the late-night long-haul trucker. When you are piloting 80,000 pounds of screaming metal through the pitch-black heart of the country at 3 in the morning, the world shrinks down to a small, illuminated cone of asphalt right in front of your windshield. Beyond that cone, there is absolutely nothing, just an endless, heavy silence. The cab of a semi-truck is a uniquely lonely place. It is a 10 by 10 foot metal box where the only company is the hypnotic hum of the tires, the rhythmic thrum of a massive diesel engine, and the static of a CB radio that rarely speaks back. Most people sleep through the deepest, darkest hours of the night, but truckers navigate them. They push through the desolation of midnight transit, crisscrossing empty deserts, dense forests, and frozen tundras. And because they spend so much time in this isolated darkness, they sometimes see things that bypass physics. They encounter things that simply should not exist. Tonight, we are going to dive deep into 5 separate, highly documented accounts where the horizon stretched into impossible, elongated silhouettes. These are the visceral, first-hand experiences of professional drivers who realized, with mounting dread, that they were being outpaced and shadowed by towering figures across desolate stretches of the world. Here are 5 terrifying encounters with tall entities reported by late-night long haulers. Case number 1, the giant stalker on Highway 50. To truly understand the sheer panic of this first encounter, you have to understand the geography of US Highway 50 in Nevada. It is famously nicknamed the loneliest road in America, and for good reason. Once you leave the neon glow of Reno behind and head east toward Ely, civilization simply stops. You are surrounded by vast, ancient valleys, towering mountain passes, and an ocean of scrub brush. At night, there is zero light pollution. If you turn off your headlights, the darkness is so complete it feels like a physical weight pressing against your eyes. Daryl Wilson was a veteran of this road. On November 12, 1998, Daryl was 42 years old and had been driving big rigs since he was fresh out of high school. He was the kind of guy who did not rattle easily. He had driven through blizzards in the Rockies, navigated brake failures on steep grades, and seen every kind of vehicular wreckage imaginable. He was a practical, cynical man who believed only in what he could see and touch. Daryl was hauling a full trailer of automotive parts from Sparks, Nevada, heading all the way out to Denver, Colorado. He was driving a customized Peterbilt 379, a massive, powerful truck that he kept in pristine condition. Around 2:15 in the morning, Daryl was cruising at a steady 70 miles per hour through the desolate stretch just outside of Eureka, Nevada. The night was entirely moonless. The only sounds in his cab were the low, steady rumble of his engine and the faint, crackling static of late-night AM radio talk shows. He had his high beams on, illuminating the cracked asphalt ahead. As he stared down the seemingly endless straightaway, a sudden flicker of movement caught the extreme right edge of his peripheral vision. Daryl instinctively let his foot ease off the accelerator, hovering over the brake pedal. In this part of the country, wild mustangs, elk, and mule deer were known to dart onto the highway, and hitting an animal at 70 miles per hour could easily jackknife a rig. He squinted into the darkness just beyond the shoulder of the road. At first, he thought his tired eyes were playing tricks on him. It looked like a pale, vertical sliver of light was moving alongside his truck. He reached over and angled his passenger side spotlight outward, clicking it on to illuminate the desert scrub parallel to the highway. What Daryl saw illuminated in that harsh, yellow beam made his blood run completely cold. Running parallel to his truck, roughly 50 yards out in the rugged desert terrain, was a figure. But it was not a human, and it was certainly not an animal. It was a bipedal entity that Daryl later estimated to be at least 9 or 10 feet tall. It was horrifyingly thin, almost skeletal, and its skin was a sickly, pale, grayish white that seemed to reflect the spotlight. But the most terrifying thing about this figure was not just its immense height or its pale skin, it was the way it moved. The entity was matching Daryl's speed perfectly. He glanced down at his speedometer. He was doing 68 miles per hour. No biological creature on Earth, certainly no bipedal one, can run at nearly 70 miles per hour. Yet, this towering figure was doing it effortlessly. Daryl pressed his face closer to the passenger side window, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could see the entity's limbs. They were impossibly long and disjointed. Its arms swung wildly, dropping so low that its multi-jointed fingers seemed to graze the tops of the sagebrush. Its legs did not bend like human legs. The knees appeared to snap backward with every colossal stride, like the hind legs of a dog, propelling it forward with terrifying, jerky bursts of speed. It didn't look like it was running. It looked like it was gliding through the air, completely unbothered by the uneven, rocky terrain beneath its feet. Panic, pure and unadulterated, seized Daryl's chest. His fight-or-flight response kicked into overdrive. He slammed his foot down on the accelerator. The massive Detroit diesel engine roared, and the Peterbilt lurched forward, accelerating to 75, then 80 miles per hour. The truck began to vibrate violently, the heavy trailer swaying slightly behind him. Daryl looked back out the window. The entity had effortlessly matched his new speed. It was still exactly 50 yards out, pacing him stride for stride. Then, the entity slowly turned its head toward the truck. Daryl let out a ragged gasp. The creature had no facial features. Where there should have been eyes, a nose, and a mouth, there was simply a smooth, pale expanse of taut skin stretched over a vaguely skull-like shape. Despite having no eyes, Daryl felt a wave of oppressive, paralyzing malice wash over him. He knew with absolute certainty that this thing was looking right at him. Suddenly, the entity changed its trajectory. Instead of running parallel to the highway, it banked sharply to the left, angling on a collision course with the road, aiming to cross directly in front of Daryl's speeding semi. "No, no, no," Daryl screamed aloud in the empty cab. If he hit this massive 9-foot-tall object at 80 miles per hour, the impact could throw his truck off the road and roll the entire rig. But if he slammed on his brakes too hard, the 80,000 pounds of momentum would cause his trailer to swing around and crush the cab like an empty soda can. Daryl had mere seconds to decide. He opted for a controlled, incredibly aggressive deceleration. He flipped on his engine brake, the Jake brake, which let out a deafening staccato roar that shattered the quiet desert night. He pumped the air brakes, wrestling with the steering wheel as the truck groaned and protested, the tires smoking and squealing against the asphalt. The truck rapidly decelerated to 40, then 30, then 20 miles per hour. Just as the truck slowed to a crawl, the entity vaulted out of the darkness and stepped onto the asphalt, perfectly illuminated in the high beams. Daryl slammed on the brakes completely, the truck coming to a violent, shuddering halt mere feet from the creature. Daryl sat frozen behind the steering wheel, completely paralyzed by fear. The entity stood in the center of the road. Up close, it was even more horrifying. Its limbs were shockingly thin, resembling pale birch tree branches. Its torso was elongated, and its chest heaved slightly, though it made no sound. The faceless entity stood there for what felt like an eternity, bathed in the harsh light of the Peterbilt's headlamps. Daryl's hand hovered over the air horn, but he was too terrified to pull the cord. He was terrified that any sudden noise would provoke it. Then, slowly, the entity reached out one of its incredibly long arms and placed a hand with too many joints gently onto the hood of Daryl's truck. Daryl could hear the faint, sickening sound of its long, pale nails scratching against the fiberglass. It lingered there for a moment, as if inspecting the vehicle. Then, in the blink of an eye, the creature retracted its arm, turned, and took 3 massive, leaping strides across the opposite lane, vanishing instantly into the pitch-black desert on the left side of the highway. Daryl sat in the middle of the empty highway for 20 full minutes, hyperventilating, unable to take his hands off the steering wheel. When he finally found the courage to put the truck back into gear, he drove the remaining distance to Ely at 40 miles per hour, checking his mirrors every 10 seconds. When Daryl arrived at a truck stop in Ely, just as the sun was coming up, he climbed out of his cab. The front of his hood was covered in a thick layer of desert dust from the trip. Right in the center, perfectly preserved in the dust, was a handprint. It was easily twice the size of a human hand, with 6 distinct, elongated fingers. Daryl took a Polaroid picture of it, quit his job the very next week, and never drove a truck at night again. Case number 2, the Appalachian colossus. Our second encounter takes us away from the open deserts of the West and into the claustrophobic, ancient forests of the East. US Route 219 winds its way through the Appalachian Mountains, cutting a treacherous path right through the heart of the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. This is not an interstate. It is a winding, 2-lane highway with steep grades, blind curves, and dense canopies of oak and pine trees that block out the stars. On October 22nd, 2004, a 36-year-old owner-operator named Jason Fleming was navigating this exact stretch of Route 219. Jason was a seasoned flatbed driver. That night, he was hauling a load that demanded absolute, hyper-focused attention: steel coils. For those who do not know, hauling steel coils is one of the most dangerous jobs in trucking. Jason had 2 massive, tightly wound spools of raw steel chained down to his flatbed trailer. Together, they weighed roughly 45,000 pounds. The physics of hauling coils are terrifying. If a driver hits the brakes too hard or too suddenly, the immense forward momentum of those coils can snap the heavy steel chains securing them. If the chains break, the coils will roll forward like massive steamrollers, effortlessly crushing the back of the cab and instantly killing the driver. Because of this, Jason was driving exceptionally carefully, anticipating every curve and grade. It was just past midnight, and the weather had taken a turn for the worse. A thick, soupy Appalachian fog had rolled in off the mountains, settling low on the highway. Visibility was reduced to maybe 30 feet. Jason had his fog lights on, crawling along at a tense 35 miles per hour, leaning forward in his seat, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The only sound was the rhythmic thumping of his windshield wipers and the low growl of his engine fighting the incline. As Jason rounded a slow, sweeping curve, his headlights pierced the fog and hit an obstruction in the road ahead. Jason instantly tensed. It looked like 2 massive, gray, dead tree trunks had fallen from the steep embankments on either side of the highway, creating an archway over the road. The trunks were incredibly thick, at least 3 feet in diameter, and they extended upward, disappearing into the dense fog canopy above. Jason's foot instinctively moved toward the brake pedal, but his mind instantly flashed to the 45,000 pounds of steel coils sitting right behind his head. He was too close. If he slammed on his brakes now, on this wet asphalt, the chains would snap. He would be crushed. He had to make a split-second calculation. The fallen trees formed an inverted V shape over the road. There was enough clearance between them for his truck to pass through if he threaded the needle perfectly. He gripped the steering wheel tight, gritted his teeth, and maintained his speed, aiming his massive rig straight for the gap between the 2 massive trunks. As his truck closed the final 20 feet, the headlights hit the surface of the trees. Jason let out an involuntary scream. They were not trees. They were covered in coarse, matted hair, the color of wet ash. And as his headlights illuminated them, the trunks shifted. They moved. They flexed with massive, impossibly huge muscles. Jason was staring at two colossal legs. He was driving straight toward a bipedal entity of incomprehensible size, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop. The front of Jason's cab passed between the two massive, hairy columns. The space between them was just wide enough to accommodate his truck. As his windshield passed under the entity, Jason, driven by morbid, primal terror, looked up. Through the upper edge of his windshield, and through the glass of his sunroof, he saw it. The legs joined at a massive, heavily muscled torso that was easily 25 feet in the air. The entity was so unimaginably tall that its upper chest and head were completely obscured by the thick, rolling fog and the branches of the overarching pine trees. As the cab of the truck passed directly underneath the creature, a smell invaded the cab through the climate control vents. Jason later described it as the most overpowering, putrid stench he had ever experienced. A sickening combination of rotting leaves, raw sewage, and heavy metallic ozone that made his eyes water and his stomach heave. For a terrifying 3 seconds, Jason's truck and his unprotected flatbed trailer carrying the steel coils rolled directly beneath the straddling colossus. He fully expected a massive hand to reach down through the fog and crush his cab, or for the creature to simply step forward and obliterate his truck. But nothing happened. The entity stood perfectly, eerily still, allowing the heavy machinery to pass directly beneath it. The moment Jason's trailer cleared the entity, he looked into his rearview mirror. The red glow of his taillights illuminated the dense fog behind him. For a brief second, he saw the massive silhouette of the legs turn, stepping entirely off the highway and vanishing effortlessly up the sheer, rocky cliff face of the mountain, moving with a silent, terrifying agility that defied its massive size. Jason did not stop. He kept his foot on the accelerator, driving through the winding mountain roads for another 3 hours until the sun finally broke through the fog and he reached a way station. When he finally pulled over and stepped out of his cab, his knees buckled. He collapsed onto the pavement, violently ill. Jason Fleming managed to deliver his load of steel coils later that day. But the moment the cargo was unchained, he drove his truck to a dealership, sold his prize rig for a massive loss, and moved to a densely populated city. He never drove through a forest again. Case number 3, the Ice Road Watcher. If there's a place more isolated than the deserts of Nevada or the forests of West Virginia, it is the James Dalton Highway in Alaska. This 414-mile stretch of dirt and ice cuts through the absolute harshest wilderness on the planet, connecting the city of Fairbanks to the oil fields of Prudhoe Bay near the Arctic Ocean. In the dead of winter, the Dalton is a frozen hellscape. The sun barely rises, the temperatures routinely drop to 50 degrees below zero, and the wind whips the snow into blinding whiteouts. If your truck breaks down out here, you don't just lose money. You lose your life to the cold in a matter of hours. Sherry Allen knew the stakes. On January 17, 2012, she was one of the few female ice road truckers braving the Dalton. She was 28 years old, tough as nails, and fiercely independent. She was driving a massive Kenworth T800, hauling 50-foot sections of heavy iron pipe bound for the oil rigs up north. It was roughly 3 o'clock in the morning, though time meant nothing in the endless Arctic night. The temperature gauge on her dashboard read negative 42 degrees Fahrenheit. She was in the middle of a massive flat expanse of frozen tundra, known as the North Slope. There were no trees, no landmarks, nothing but an endless sea of white ice reflecting her headlights. Suddenly, an alarm blared in her cab. The air pressure gauge for her brakes was plummeting rapidly. Sherry cursed loudly. The extreme cold was causing moisture in the air lines between her cab and her trailer to freeze, creating an ice blockage. If the lines froze completely, the brakes on her trailer would automatically lock up, leaving her stranded in the middle of nowhere. She had no choice. She had to get out and clear the line. Sherry layered up. She put on her sub-zero insulated coveralls, a heavy parka, 2 layers of thermal gloves, a thick balaclava, and a headlamp. She grabbed a small, portable blowtorch from under her seat, the standard tool for thawing frozen airlines, and opened her door. The cold hit her like a physical blow. It took the breath from her lungs. The wind was howling, kicking up a fine, powdery snow that stung her exposed eyes. She climbed down the steps of her Kenworth, her heavy boots crunching loudly on the packed ice of the highway. She walked toward the gap between the back of her cab and the front of her trailer, clicking on her blowtorch. The bright blue flame hissed to life. She ducked her head down, crawling slightly underneath the trailer, and began to run the flame along the frozen, rigid air lines. She worked for about 5 minutes. The wind was so loud, it deafened her to anything else. But suddenly, an unnatural stillness seemed to fall over the immediate area. The howling wind did not stop, but the feeling of the air changed. The hair on the back of Sherry's neck stood straight up. A deeply primal instinct, an evolutionary alarm bell passed down from ancient ancestors, began to ring in her brain. She was being watched. Sherry stopped moving the blowtorch. She slowly turned her head, looking out from beneath the trailer toward the vast, dark expanse of the tundra. About 30 feet away from her truck, standing in the swirling snow, was a figure. At first, her brain struggled to process what it was seeing. It was entirely white, not the color of a polar bear, but a stark, luminous, completely hairless white that almost seemed to glow against the darkness of the Arctic night. It was standing incredibly still, completely unfazed by the sub-zero temperatures. But it was the sheer scale of the entity that made Sherry's heart stop. The figure was easily 15 feet tall. It was horrifyingly slender, its limbs stretched out like taffy. It had a long, cylindrical torso and arms that hung past what would be its knees. Its legs were planted firmly in the snow, like two pale pillars. Sherry was frozen in terror, still clutching the hissing blowtorch beneath her trailer. She watched as the towering entity slowly, deliberately bent at the waist. It folded its impossibly long upper body downward, bringing its face closer to the ground, trying to get a better look underneath the truck. It was looking for her. As its face came into the glow of her headlamp, Sherry let out a whimpering gasp. The entity had no nose and no mouth. The lower half of its face was completely smooth. But its eyes were two massive, sunken, completely black voids. They were not just the color black. They looked like holes torn in the fabric of reality, absorbing all the light around them. The entity stared directly into Sherry's eyes. It did not blink. It did not make a sound. It just hovered there, its massive white head mere feet off the ground, staring at the small, terrified human cowering beneath the heavy machinery. Suddenly, the air pressure valve on the truck released with a massive, deafening hiss. The line had thawed. The sudden, violent noise startled the entity. It violently snapped its head back up, standing to its full, towering 15-foot height. In a blur of motion so fast it made Sherry dizzy, the creature turned and sprinted out onto the frozen tundra. It didn't run like a human. It moved with massive, bounding leaps, covering 50 feet of ground with every stride, until it vanished entirely into the whiteout conditions. Sherry didn't remember climbing out from under the trailer. She didn't remember scrambling up the steps of her truck or slamming the door. The next thing she knew, she was sitting in the driver's seat, her entire body shaking so violently she could barely put the truck into gear. She drove the remaining 100 miles to Prudhoe Bay in a state of absolute shock. When she arrived at the security checkpoint, the guards had to physically help her out of the cab. She was treated for mild hypothermia and severe shock. Sherry Allen finished her contract that winter, but she never returned to Alaska. She moved to Florida, where the land is flat, and the temperature never drops below freezing. Case number 4, the stilt walker of the Chihuahuan Desert. In the blistering heat of the American Southwest, the danger usually comes from the sun, the dehydration, and the oppressive, relentless temperature. But at night, the desert transforms. It becomes a sprawling, alien landscape of shadows and moonlight. On July 4th, 1989, Marcus Abernathy, known to everyone on the CB radio as Big Mac, was hauling a refrigerated trailer full of fresh California produce across Interstate 10. He was right on the border between Arizona and New Mexico, cutting through the heart of the Chihuahuan Desert. Marcus was 55 years old, a massive man with a booming voice and a reputation for telling tall tales. But what happened to him that night was no story. It was a brutally hot summer night. The air conditioning unit in his cab had completely failed outside of Phoenix, leaving Marcus to suffer in the sweltering 95-degree midnight heat. To keep from passing out, he had both the driver and passenger side windows rolled completely down, letting the hot, dry desert wind blast through the cab. He was cruising at 65 miles per hour on a stretch of I-10 that was dead straight for miles. There were no other headlights in front of him or behind him. It was just Marcus, his truck, and the vast, empty desert bathed in the bright light of a full moon. Over the deafening roar of the wind rushing through the open windows, Marcus began to hear a rhythmic sound. Thud, thud, thud. It was a deep, resonant vibration that he could feel in the floorboards of the cab. At first, Marcus thought he was blowing a tire on his trailer. A blown tire on a heavy rig sounds like a shotgun blast, followed by the heavy thumping of shredded rubber hitting the underside of the trailer. He checked his side mirrors, looking for sparks or flying debris. Nothing. The tires looked fine, but the sound continued, and it was getting louder, and strangely, it was keeping perfect time with the speed of his truck. Thud, thud, thud. Marcus frowned, wiping sweat from his forehead. He leaned over slightly, looking out the open passenger side window into the moonlit desert landscape. About 100 yards off the highway, moving through the sagebrush and cacti, was a silhouette. Because of the bright moonlight, Marcus could see the figure clearly against the lighter color of the desert sand. It was a humanoid figure, but its proportions were entirely grotesque. Its legs were unimaginably long, resembling massive, dark telephone poles. The torso was short and blocky, and the arms swung stiffly at its sides. Marcus estimated the entity had to be easily 20 to 25 feet tall. It was walking, but because its legs were so incredibly long, a normal walking pace for this creature allowed it to match Marcus's speed of 65 miles per hour. Each massive stride covered 30 to 40 feet of desert floor. When its heavy, indistinct feet struck the sand, it created the massive thud that Marcus was hearing over the sound of his engine. "What in the hell?" Marcus whispered to himself, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles ached. The entity did not seem to be aggressive. It was simply walking parallel to the highway, pacing the truck. It looked almost like a massive stick figure made of pure, dense shadow, striding effortlessly through the harsh terrain. Marcus decided to test it. He gently applied the brakes, slowing his rig down to 50 miles per hour. Out in the desert, the towering entity seamlessly slowed its pace, matching him perfectly. Marcus accelerated, pushing the heavy truck up to 75 miles per hour. The engine whined in protest. The entity simply lengthened its stride, its massive legs scissoring through the air, faster, effortlessly maintaining the exact distance of 100 yards parallel to the truck. Then, the true horror of the situation dawned on Marcus. He was completely alone. His windows were down. If this massive entity decided to close the distance and cross the highway, there was absolutely nothing protecting him. It could simply reach down into his open window and pluck him out of the driver's seat like a child picking up a toy. Panic set in. Marcus grabbed his CB radio microphone, his thumb trembling as he pressed the transmit button. Breaker 19. Breaker 19. This is Big Mac. Anybody got their ears on? I need some help out here on I-10 East, near mile marker 340. Does anyone read me? Static hissed back at him. Damn it, is anyone out there? Marcus yelled into the mic. I got something following me. Something massive, pacing my rig out in the desert. I need someone on this road. More static. Then, a faint, crackling voice came through the speaker. I read you, Big Mac. This is Silver Bullet, about 20 miles behind you. What exactly is following you? Marcus looked out the passenger window. The entity had turned its massive, shadowy head. It was now looking directly at the truck as it walked. It's a man, Marcus said, his voice shaking. A man on stilts. But they ain't stilts. He's 20 feet tall, Silver Bullet. He's walking right beside me, doing 70. There was a long pause on the radio. When Silver Bullet replied, the playful trucker tone was entirely gone. His voice was dead serious. Big Mac, Listen to me very carefully. Do not slow down. Do not look at it. Roll up your windows, turn your radio up loud, and keep your foot on the gas. Do not pull over for any reason until you hit the truck stop in Las Cruces. Do you copy? I copy, Marcus breathed, hurriedly cranking the manual window handles to roll up the glass, trapping the sweltering heat inside the cab. Marcus stared straight ahead, his eyes glued to the white lines of the highway. He could still hear the rhythmic, booming thuds of the entity's footsteps outside. It paced him for another excruciating 20 miles. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the thudding stopped. Marcus didn't dare look in the mirror. He drove straight to Las Cruces, pulled into the well-lit fuel island, and locked his doors. When he finally met Silver Bullet inside the diner, the older trucker just poured him a cup of coffee. Silver Bullet told Marcus that he had been driving that route for 30 years, and he wasn't the first to see the stilt walker. The unwritten rule of I-10 was simple. If you see the walker, you keep driving, and you never, ever let it know that you see it. Case number 5, the overpass entity. Our final encounter takes us to Canada, specifically to a notoriously remote and dangerous stretch of the Trans-Canada Highway system. Highway 17 inches Northern Ontario wraps around the massive, rugged, northern shore of Lake Superior. This area is dominated by the Canadian Shield, ancient, unforgiving bedrock covered in dense, dark boreal forests that press tightly against the edge of the asphalt. Driving this route at night feels like driving through a deep, claustrophobic canyon of pine trees. On March 23rd, 2018, a young driver named David Gibson was navigating this treacherous route. David was 24, fairly new to long-haul trucking, but eager to prove himself. He was pulling a heavy 53-foot dry van trailer loaded with paper products, heading east towards Sault Ste. Marie. It was a cold, rainy night. The rain was coming down in heavy, blinding sheets, turning the highway into a slick, reflective hazard. David had his wipers on high, his defroster blasting, and his eyes glued to the wet road. In this part of Ontario, moose are a massive danger. Hitting a 1,200-pound moose in a semi-truck can total the cab and send the rig careening into the deep ravines that line the highway. David was constantly scanning the dense tree line on the left and right, looking for the telltale reflection of eyes in his headlights. Around 1:45 in the morning, David was approaching a rare piece of infrastructure in this wilderness, an old, concrete wildlife overpass. These are bridges built entirely for animals to cross safely over the busy highway, covered in dirt and vegetation to blend in with the forest. As David's headlights swept up to illuminate the concrete arch of the overpass, he saw a shape hanging off the edge. At first, through the heavy rain, he thought it was a massive patch of dead vines, or a fallen tree branch, dangling from the top of the bridge. But as his truck rapidly closed the distance, his high beams caught the shape clearly. It was a humanoid figure clinging to the top edge of the concrete overpass. The entity was impossibly long. Its upper body was anchored to the top of the bridge, but its torso and arms hung down toward the highway below, stretching a terrifying 15 to 20 feet toward the asphalt. It was completely hairless, its skin a sickly, pale gray that looked slick and shiny in the heavy rain. David gasped, his foot instinctively hovering over the brake. But he was going 50 miles per hour on wet roads with a heavy load. He couldn't stop in time. He was going to pass directly under it. As the front of David's cab went beneath the overpass, the entity reached out. Thump. A massive, violent shudder rocked David's entire truck. The sound was deafening, like a massive boulder had been dropped directly onto the roof of his aluminum trailer. The weight of the impact was so severe that the front wheels of the cab momentarily lifted a fraction of an inch off the wet asphalt, messing with the steering. David fought the wheels, screaming out loud, managing to keep the massive rig straight. "What the hell? What the hell?" he yelled, his heart hammering in his throat. He immediately looked into his driver's side mirror. What he saw in the reflection of the red running lights on his trailer sent his mind into a state of pure, primal panic. The entity had not fallen onto the highway. It had dropped onto the top of his moving 53-foot trailer. But it wasn't just sitting there. The creature was crawling forward, David could hear the terrifying metallic screeching of something heavy and sharp dragging across the thin aluminum roof of his trailer. The sound was echoing down into the cab. David looked in his side mirror again. Coming down from the top edge of the trailer, right behind the cab, was an arm. It was a pale, gray, sickly limb that was entirely too long, with joints that bent at grotesque, unnatural angles. The arm snaked down the side of the trailer, reaching toward the gap between the trailer and the cab. Then, a hand appeared. It was massive, easily 3 times the size of a human hand, with 7 incredibly long, multi-jointed fingers ending in thick, dark claws. The hand reached across the gap and slapped wetly against the back window of David's sleeper cab. David screamed, pure adrenaline flooding his system. The hand began to drag itself around the side of the cab, moving toward David's driver's side door. The long, gray fingers gripped the edge of the door frame, right next to David's window. The entity was trying to look inside. It was trying to get him. David knew if he stopped the truck, he was dead. He slammed his foot down on the accelerator, pushing the pedal to the floorboard. The massive engine roared, fighting the heavy load and the wet road, accelerating to 60, then 70 miles per hour. The truck was hydroplaning slightly, dancing dangerously close to the edge of the steep ravines. But David didn't care. He just kept his foot down. The pale, multi-jointed fingers maintained their vice-like grip on his doorframe. The creature was incredibly strong, easily holding on against the violent wind shear of a truck doing 70 miles per hour in a rainstorm. David could hear the heavy, wet thumping of the creature's massive body shifting on the roof above his head. David kept driving like a madman. He drove for 30 terrifying minutes, staring straight ahead, refusing to look at the horrifying fingers gripping the metal inches from his head. Finally, in the distance, the glowing halogen lights of a large commercial truck stop cut through the rain. It was an oasis of light in the middle of the dark forest. David didn't slow down to use the exit ramp. He careened the truck off the highway, tearing across the dirt median, and slammed the brakes as he skidded into the massive, brightly lit parking lot. The truck shuddered violently to a halt right under the massive canopy lights of the fuel island. The sudden stop, combined with the bright, blinding lights of the gas station, seemed to break the creature's grip. As the truck lurched to a halt, David heard a massive scramble on the roof. The long gray fingers disappeared from his doorframe. He looked in his passenger side mirror just in time to see a massive, impossibly long, pale figure leap from the top of his trailer. It hit the wet pavement, scrambling on all fours like a giant, horrifying spider, and darted instantly back into the darkness of the surrounding tree line, vanishing from the lights. David locked his doors and crawled into his sleeper berth, clutching a tire iron. He didn't come out until the sun was fully up. When he finally inspected his rig, the entire top of his aluminum trailer was completely caved in and covered in massive, deep gouges that tore right through the metal, exposing the insulation underneath. David Gibson had a dash cam running that night. While it only pointed forward and didn't capture the entity dropping from the bridge, the microphone captured everything. It captured David's screams, the violent impact on the roof, and the terrifying 20-minute-long audio of heavy claws tearing through metal just inches above his head. David gave the audio to his dispatch company, turned in his keys, and never drove a commercial vehicle again. These 5 accounts represent a terrifying fraction of the stories whispered in truck stops and over late-night radio waves. They are a chilling reminder that when you leave the safety of the city and venture out onto the lonely highways of the world, you are entering a vast, isolated territory where the rules of reality no longer apply. The long haulers who drive these routes know the truth. Out in the dark, you are never truly alone. And sometimes, the things waiting by the side of the road are not just watching, they are keeping pace. That is going to do it for tonight's journey into the dark, folks. I am your host, Midnight Rider, and you have been listening to Channel 19 Mysteries. If these highway horrors sent a chill down your spine and made you double check your rearview mirror, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a transmission in the dead of night. I also want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let me know which of these towering entities terrified you the most, or if you have any theories on what these drivers actually encountered out there in the isolation. The open road is a vast, unpredictable, and sometimes terrifying place. If you have your own stories, creepy encounters, or unexplained sightings from your time behind the wheel, I want to read them. Send your firsthand accounts directly to mycreepyencounter@gmail.com, and your story might just be the next one broadcast over our midnight airwaves. Until our next haul into the unknown, keep your high beams on, keep your doors locked, and whatever you do, stay safe out there.